Welcome to Inside the Vault, Enterprise Bank's podcast series where we talk about items of interest to the small business community. Today, we're going to talk with Brian Gaudio of the Module family of companies, one of our bank's clients who's got some innovative methods of construction and design in the modular industry. Brian, welcome to Inside the Vault.
Thanks. Happy to be inside the vault here.
Sure. So, as I said, what we're going to do today, hopefully, is talk a little bit about you and the company and also give our viewers and listeners some insight into the modular construction industry. But probably the best place to start is always at the beginning. So why don't you give us a little background on you and your team and Module to this point, and then we'll talk about, the whole modular construction business.
Sure. So I am originally from Pittsburgh, grew up in the South Hills, and I'm trained as an architect. And I had worked in the West Coast. I worked in Biloxi, Mississippi. I lived in the Dominican Republic. And a lot of the work I was doing was, we called it public interest design. The question I was trying to answer was, how do we bring good design in terms of housing to more people? How do we make that more accessible to more people? So I had worked at a firm that started after Hurricane Katrina, that did a lot of rebuilding in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Yep.
And then lived in the Dominican Republic and was working there again, kind of after a natural disaster hits. How do these cities rebuild themselves? How do they do it quickly? Mm-hmm. So that was always, that question of how do we bring good design to more people was always fascinating to me. And back in 2015, I was living abroad and I said, well, I could, what do I want to do next? And I had always told people about how much I loved Pittsburgh, but I hadn't lived there since really growing up. And so I said, I'm going to move back to Pittsburgh and try to start a company that brings better quality housing to more people. And so that's when I called up a couple of friends and just started tossing this idea around with them. So I have two co-founders. One, his name's Drew Brisley. He and I went to school together at NC State. So I was an architecture student. He was an industrial design student. So he designs products. And he was working in Seattle at the time. So I had to convince him to move to Pittsburgh, which we can talk about. And then my other co-founder, her name's Hallie Dumont. She's also local to Pittsburgh. And she worked in the renovation remodeling industry. And she was just frustrated with the quality of housing that was out there. And she felt that there has to be a better way to do this. So like the three of us shared that common belief or that common goal. So that's kind of a little bit of background on the three of us.
So you started out, I guess, kind of focusing on where you came from, which is the design side. So if you walk us a little through the history of Module Design, which is one of your companies.
Sure. So the original idea we had for the company, it was one step of innovation further even than where we are today, actually. The initial concept was a home that grows with you. So you start small with a one-bedroom, single-story house, and then as your family grows, right, you have kids or grandma moves in, you can pop the roof off of the house, bring another story in like a Lego block, and stack it on top. So you'd stack up to 3 stories as your family grows. So really cool concept. It was something I had seen in other parts of the world where people build without traditional mortgages, right? They don't have a mortgage, so they save up as much money as they have today. They build the amount of house they can afford, and then as their family grows, their house grows with them.
Okay.
So that was the initial concept, and I still remember the very first, we were trying to figure out how do we start a business around this concept. So I called up my old shop teacher, and I went to the shop, and I made these little architecture models of the houses to show people what they look like. Because that's, and as an architect,
you got to be visual, yeah.
Yeah, you got to be visual. So I went to the shop, built these little models, and would carry them in a shoebox. I kid you not, I had a little shoebox with me, and I'd walk, I'd be in the city of Pittsburgh, like, what is this guy doing with the shoebox? But that's all, we had no customers, we had no product. So
this is circa, you said?
2016.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I was just trying to learn how to be an entrepreneur. And so there were a lot of good resources in Pittsburgh and a couple of startup groups and meetup groups. And I still remember the very first pitch competition that we won. I brought my, the model to the presentation. There were a bunch of other tech companies
right.
there pitching, and we pitched our idea, and the audience voted. I remember it was an audience vote, and we won $500. And I called Drew. I said, Drew, what are we going to do with all this money? How do we split it? So we just had to learn about running a business. We had no experience in that. We were skilled in the design field, but had to really learn how a business worked and how a startup worked.
So modular wasn't necessarily your focus. It was just more of a conceptual focus about, I guess, affordable, flexible housing that kind of can cover multiple stages of somebody's life. Correct?
That's right.
So my understanding from being in other parts of the country is, as often is the case with us in the Rust Belt or Western PA, we're a little behind the times in terms of, different trends, whether it be in construction or otherwise. So modular is pretty popular in other parts of the world, right? Or even other parts of the country.
Yes. So with that initial idea of the home that grows with you, one of the concepts was, wouldn't it be cool if you could just ship the addition, right, for that second story on a truck? And that's how we started researching modular. But what we found, and why we put that initial idea on the shelf we even patented a roof system, but we put that idea on the shelf because when we started to talk to lenders, we didn't really know how the real estate industry worked, right? Your construction loan is based on the value of that property. And how do you determine the value? It's based on an appraisal. Okay. So when a bank would come up and say, hey, we'll give you 80% of the value of that house, but we're going to determine the value by how many other one-bedroom, 500 square foot, single-story homes have been built in the neighborhood in the last 5 years, and that's zero.
Right.
So we said, all right, we're not going to move forward with that concept, but we like this idea of building in a factory. It just kind of makes sense. And then the other piece of our business said, we want to build a really energy-efficient home, a really sustainable home, because one, it can make our customers, our homeowners, their utility bills will be lower. And two, it's a good thing to do for the environment, and that's something we believe in. So that's when we latched onto this modular concept. And as you said, it's done, modular's existed for years and years and decades. What's interesting, and I think why we were able to get to where we are today, is that state of Pennsylvania is like the modular, it's like the modular Silicon Valley, so to speak. We have about 30 modular factories scattered throughout Pennsylvania, and they ship regionally, but there's a lot of modular factories. So what we started to do is go visit them. And he said, we have this idea for a home that's energy efficient, and it's for infill, right? This is a home that goes in a city neighborhood where you go up, not out. And so we started meeting with some of these modular factories and said, hey, would you guys be willing to be a contract manufacturer? So we started to learn about the industry, just tour through a lot of these factories. And I think a lot of people hear modular and
I know where you're going to go. They're thinking, double wide trailer.
Exactly. and that's the reason why they think that is it makes sense, because if we look at the number of single family homes in the United States, of like, let's say there's 100 single family homes by percentage in the United States. 3 of those would be built modularly. 12 of those would be built like a trailer, a double wide, and then the rest, 85, would be built traditionally. So there's actually 4 times the mobile homes out there than there are modular homes. And there's a couple publicly traded companies that build mobile homes, and that's kind of it's a rural housing typology. Right. But there's a big difference between a mobile home or a trailer home and a modular home. And the key difference is a mobile home is built to a completely separate building code. So HUD, Housing and Urban Development, created its own building code for a mobile home. And so it basically has less, you can build a much cheaper house that way because the code restrictions are not that high. Mm-hmm. The other thing is the chassis, the transport on which it's shipped stays with the house. So that's why they call it a mobile home, is because that chassis is literally part of the structure. So it doesn't have to be put on a traditional foundation. It's built to a different code. A modular home is built to the same code that Ryan Homes or Miranda builds to. It's just done in a factory setting. So with our business, we have to educate our customers and our partners about the difference between a mobile home and a modular home. So that's a lot of what I do, is educating folks on that.
And I think one of the most important distinctions is modular, like you just said a few minutes ago, can go up, not out.
That's right.
And it's traditional real estate from a lending, tax, treatment perspective. It's just that the above ground components are built on a factory floor.
Exactly.
And you mentioned a couple of the benefits or advantages of modular versus traditional. Can you kind of walk through those?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the benefits of building a modular home are that you can build the project faster. So we can build up to 40% faster. And if you think about, if you're a developer building a project, right, you have carrying costs during the cycle of your project, right? You got to pay taxes on the land. You got to pay interest to the bank. You've got to pay utilities during that time. So if you can shrink your construction time down by up to 40%, and most times 25, I think, is very achievable, and 40s if you really push it,
Right.
then you can build more houses, and you can, as a bank, you can lend more loans, right?
Right.
So I think that's one of the benefits is the speed of construction. The other is the quality control. So if you think about, now it's been a beautiful summer in Pittsburgh, but come wintertime, lumber gets delivered to a project site and it snows, and I'm looking at OSB that's soaking wet, and we're going to use that to build, the house that someone's family is going to live in. I think there's a better way to do that. So in the factory, your materials are all built in a over roof, right, in a controlled environment. So you don't have the elements to deal with. So you're getting basically a dried in shell for each of the floors done in the factory, where your workforce isn't up on the third story of a building, right, to build the roof. That roof is sitting on the ground in the factory. So it's an easier environment for the workers and for the materials, I think. And I think that provides a better quality built product.
So the tolerances, obviously building on a factory floor, are much tighter. I was amazed when I visited one of your projects, your recent projects. You guys actually need air handlers for the properties because they're so tightly constructed that they don't necessarily breathe like a normal stick built, because they're obviously built to a much higher tolerance on a factory floor.
Yes, and so we can close up those walls. We put extra insulation.
That's energy efficiency. Yeah,
exactly. So we're not, as my dad would say, you don't want to heat the neighborhood, right? So what we're doing is have a really tight exterior walls of the house. And then because we do that, as you mentioned, we have this, in addition to the typical HVAC system in the house, we have this air handler where it's basically cycling in fresh air. It's like the lungs of the house. Yeah. It's letting it breathe. And so those are things that go above and beyond a typical code-built home, right? That one of the big production builders would build.
So what kind of, versus a traditional stick build, I mean, how much more efficient are these modular?
So we can be... we're significantly more efficient from an energy standpoint. So if you look at like the average home that someone buys in Pittsburgh, our homes can be up to 80% more energy efficient. And that's because we have extra insulation in the walls, we have those air handling units, we have high efficiency windows. So it's all of these little things that add up to a much better house. One of the things we do is we put insulation, in addition to in the walls, we put it on the outside of the walls. And that's basically like wearing a jacket, right? You're going outside, you wear a jacket, you're going to stay cooler, or you're going to stay warmer when you're out, when you're out in the cold. And so we do that on all of our homes. And I think that's important because if you look at the total cost of ownership for a home, you have your mortgage payment, you got your, insurance, and then you have your utilities, right? So if you buy a house that has, your mortgage payment may be really inexpensive, but if you are paying out the arm and the leg to heat that thing and cool that thing, then your total cost of ownership is actually higher than you would want. So our goal is to keep those utility bills significantly lower.
So is there anything else unique kind of about the construction process in terms of modular versus stick built?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's interesting. It's the same sticks and bricks.
Yeah.
But if you're a local contractor, you're used to building a particular way, and you're used to materials showing up at the job site. So there's some nuances to it. The biggest nuance is what we call set day. That's the day when the boxes, we ship them out of the factory to a nearby, we call it a staging area.
Yeah.
And then on the day, I think Jesse came when we did the project.
Yeah. On the north side.
The north side. That is the set day when we lift the boxes off the trailers and onto the foundation and fix it onto the foundation. So in that case, we were building 2 homes attached on one side, so semi-detached houses, and we had 6 boxes to lift, and that was
and this is infill, so this is city streets and neighboring properties.
city street, one-way street, houses on either side, power lines in front. It was like a
engineering.
It was a high degree of difficulty. It was like in the Olympics when they show the degree of difficulty on the routines. It was a high degree of difficulty, and on top of that, it was 8 degrees that day. We have some great photos and videos, and I think Jesse was there for part of it. But we were out there in the cold, but we got it done. And so that's a unique part of modular, is that you got to rent a crane during that day. We may have to close some of the streets, right? Which I guess sometimes you do in bigger commercial projects. But that is a unique part of modular. So our job in that case, we were the general contractor as well on the project. But when we partner with other general contractors, let's say we're doing a job in another market like Cleveland, we're working with a contractor there. It's my job to educate that local contractor on what do they have to do to have the site prep before we drop those boxes off. And then after we drop those boxes off, what do they have to do to take it from there to the finish line? So we developed this thing called the construction playbook, where we built out this online resources basically targeted for general contractors, so they can read and understand and watch videos on how the heck, if I'm going to try this modular thing, where's my guidebook? And that's what we've built out for them.
So how much of specification changes do you all as the builder have with the factories in terms of custom and or an end buyer if they would decide they want to buy modular?
So that's a great question. And I find that each factory, and now that we've started our own factory in Pittsburgh, which is really exciting. About, yes, I'd love to talk about that. So each factory has its own kind of supply chain that it buys from. So while a lot of local general contractors might buy stuff from Home Depot, 84, Lowe's, some of these mod factories, because they're building a higher volume, they're actually going to wholesalers. And so they each have their own kind of supply chain. So we offer maybe 4 or 5 kinds of flooring, 4 or 5 kinds of cabinets. So it's interesting to see when we've worked with, before starting our own factory, we'd worked with 5 factories, and each of them has, roughly the same kind of options, but it's, might be from this supplier, from that supplier. So what we did was we designed a product that was not so specific, it was really well thought out in terms of the floor plan, but the finishes would work within their existing supply chain. So it's not like we were asking for special things, because anytime you ask for special things in construction, the cost goes up.
Which is a great segue. So we talked about, obviously, much more energy efficient, lower cost of operation going forward. What are the costs of modular construction versus traditional?
So that's a great question. That's actually one of the misconceptions when people come to us. So they'll come to our website and they will assume, oh man, it's modular. It must be way less expensive than traditionally built home. And if it were a mobile home, the answer is absolutely yes, because it's a different building code.
Right.
But we're building to the same building code that Ryan Homes is building to. And so realistically, our costs are roughly the same as to build it on site.
But you're building for future cost savings on the energy side.
That's right. So we're cost competitive with most, general contractors in Pittsburgh. If they were to build it site built and we were to build it modularly, what our customers say is, I like module because I can get a better product faster for the same price. That's kind of how they
when you talk about carrying costs, there's some cost savings there ultimately, whether you're the contractor or you're building your own house.
Mm-hmm. And so roughly, like in our factory today, our cost of sometimes that depends on the square footage of the product, but a lot of the homes we're building that are about 1,500 square feet or anywhere from 120 to 160 bucks a foot out of the factory is typically the cost out of the factory to ship it, build it and ship it there. Mm-hmm. What that doesn't include is your on-site construction costs, your foundation, your site work, and things like that.
And that's the other thing, if you want to talk through real quick, because, again, when people think mobile home, there's not a lot of site work because it is a mobile home. Yep. In your case, these are, I don't want to call them traditional, but they're foundation-based, precast, or block. Site prep is pretty similar to stick built, right?
Exactly. So your site costs, and in the city of Pittsburgh, if you're building, right, you got to rip the street up, you got to put the new sidewalk in, So your site costs are putting your utilities in, excavating, putting your foundations in. And that's kind of before we drop the boxes. And then after we drop the boxes, the local contractor is going to put the siding on the house,
Wire everything together.
Yeah, they'll basically make these connections because each floor is almost like a Lego block. So they'll make connections between the utilities between floors. If there's a basement, they will finish the basement out on site. So there's a lot of these, or the garages in the rear, right? They're going to build those traditionally. Those are not going to come from the factory. So there's a lot of those kind of small things that add up actually to a good amount of scope for a local contractor.
So what types of things have you either built and or designed in the history of the module family of companies? And I want to talk about the factory. But
Sure. The first house we delivered was it was in Friendship, and it was a single-story home for someone's parents who were downsizing. So when we launched the company, we were working with one-off homeowners. So if you wanted to buy a piece of land and build a house, you could call us, and we would do that for you. Kind of turnkey, design it, build it, done. So that was a home for their parents. They were probably 70 or 80 years old. So they wanted to stay close to their adult children, and so we had thought through this single-story living design that was easy to get around, no step into the shower. That was the first house we had built. And then since then, a lot of the stuff is infill. We'll do some market rate housing. We'll do some affordable housing. So a lot of our customers today are small local developers that are building housing. So there's a group called City of Bridges Community Land Trust. They operate mostly in Allegheny County, and they're building a lot of for sale housing that is affordable. So they get some grants from local foundations and the local government to subsidize the sale price, and they'll sell that to someone who's making less than 80% of the median income. So a lot of our product, that's a lot of what we're building today. But we've also built some market rate housing. So with Enterprise Bank, we worked on some market rate housing, which we're just going to...
And that's where you guys have taken the jump into you actually own the property rather than building for others.
That's right. That's where we served as the developer. There was another project. So I'd say probably 20% of the work that we do, if I had to look at our total jobs today, about 20% of that time we're the developer and we're the contractor and we're the architect. So we're doing the whole thing. And then 80% we're the architect, we're the contractor, and the factory on it. So another project we built was in Garfield. And that was the first time we served as a developer. And I remember that because we had to get a construction loan for the first time. And the bank looked at us as we were 2019. So we had basically finished one house. And the banks, there were two lenders on the project because the one lender said, well, we'll give you 50% of or 40% loan to value. And I said, okay, what about you over there? He said, all right, we'll give you another 40. So we got to 80. But that was contingent on two of the homes were for sale and one we were going to keep as a show home. And it was actually the one we were going to keep was a duplex. So it had a first floor apartment and then a kind of a house on top. And so the lender said, we'll give you a loan, but somebody's got to sign a lease to live there. So I said, all right, I'm signing the lease. So I signed a lease and I lived in the bottom little apartment and we had our show home up top. So when customers would come by, just get up, get out of bed and walk upstairs. So it was fun. Yeah.
What's, this has been residential housing to date. Is this catching traction locally in the commercial world?
There is some commercial modular. There's actually a company in Pennsylvania called ModLogic. So some groups, in Pittsburgh, they said, oh, those are those modular guys. So they'll give us a call. And there was a group on the south side, Samara Road, near the Cheesecake Factory and that plaza. And they wanted to build these little, almost like shipping container food stands. They called us up and they said, can you guys do that? And I said, it's not really our bread and butter because we're residential, single family, 3 stories or less. But we referred them to this group called ModLogic that does steel, light gauge steel, and even moment frame steel modular. So they built these little stands. So if you ever go to the south side in that little park, I think it's near the Cheesecake
I know what
Factory,
you're talking about. Yeah.
Those were built in a factory. So each of those little boxes out there were built in a factory. A lot of there's hospitals that are getting built modularly now. So,
I heard there's some in the lodging industry and the hotel industry too. That's become more of a practice, the modular construction in the hotel industry.
Yes, because of that repeatability of
Right.
the product, it's the same exact
Yeah.
product. There's companies, there's a couple of hotel brands, like there's some Holiday Inns that have been built
Right.
modularly. There's a brand called Citizen M that's in some of the bigger cities in the US. Those
Right.
are all built
Yeah.
modularly, which is a good use for it, I think.
Yeah. But getting back to your bread and butter, which is, residential real estate.
hmm
What about a lot of our viewers and listeners are investment real estate people?
hmm
So what's been the acceptance there for people using this for not their own home, but for
hmm
rental properties or investment properties?
So what I find interesting, so last year we were invited. The government has this showcase every year on the National Mall of new
Hmm.
methods of construction. So
Right.
it's 3D printed, it's mobile homes, and it's modular and all this stuff. So we built this little backyard home. We called it it's called an accessory dwelling unit. Like the idea of you put a granny flat, right?
Right.
Some relative can live in the backyard. We built one of those here in Pittsburgh, and we shipped it to the mall. And we had sat it right on the National Mall and had even the Secretary of HUD walk through our, it was kind of fun. But while we were there, we saw a couple of units, and the sponsors of those units were these build for rent developers. And so, because in this build for rent has caught on a good bit, the idea is it's still a single family home, but all of the unique fixtures and finishes that a homeowner wants to customize, you don't have to do that. So, I
Right.
see a lot of interest in using modular for these build for rent developers because they can build the same
Right.
house as a rental versus changing this up or changing that up.
So let's talk about the latest development. Exciting. You guys, as you mentioned, you worked with a number of different plants, manufacturing plants that were building modular. And you guys have taken a step to kind of bring that in house, right?
Yeah, huge step, big step into a big. I was joking earlier. It's we opened this plant in. So we started our first manufacturing project in May of this year, and so we leased 22,000 square feet in Carnegie, it's the old Superior Steel site, and big old building, overhead crane, giant garage door because we ship these large, oversized loads. And it's something we had talked about for a while. And the reason why we decided to do it were two. One, when we were asking the contract manufacturers, can you make this a little bit different? Can you
Yeah.
tweak this? Can you tweak that? They're like, hey, buddy, you're not our biggest customer. So
Right.
no, thank you. So there were a couple of improvements to the product we wanted to make that were unique to our brand. And so we felt that was a good reason. The other reason was we started to talk to some of the larger developers in town. And so we started having really formative conversations with some big developers that are getting tax credit financing and things like that. And they said, Brian, I'd love to try modular, but to export jobs outside of the county, when I'm getting money from the county, it doesn't really work.
Right.
So I said, okay, if we have a manufacturing facility in the county, now you're no longer that red flag doesn't exist anymore, right? So now I think we're really well positioned to serve. In addition to some of the small developers that we work with, we can now serve some of the bigger developers in the region with some of these unique tax credit projects. But it's been a crazy. I mean, it's not easy. We thought, oh, we've been through a dozen plants. How hard could it be? Oh, it's hard. It's just a lot of space to clean if you think about it. Brooming 22,000 square feet is not an easy task.
How was it on the staffing side?
For 90 days, normally I'm out talking to customers.
Yeah.
But for 90 days, when we started that plant, myself, Drew, and Marquise, we were there every day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., really learning how to become a manufacturer, which was really a great experience. So we had to set up the equipment because there's some equipment associated with building, make sure we learn how to use the overhead cranes, learn how to operate the forklifts. And so we were in there really getting our hands dirty. And we started our first project May 20th. It's 2 homes that are going to go in the Hill District for a developer who's a nonprofit developer there. He's building some affordable housing. Yeah. So those started on the 20th of May, and they're probably going to ship out end of next month. So it's going to be pretty exciting to see those. And you walk into that, as I walk into that space, and having been through a bunch of factories, but to say, oh, wow, this is our factory, that is our product. It's really rewarding. it's empowering to see that.
Yeah. And you guys are catching traction outside of Pittsburgh too, right? So what are some of the other market areas that you guys are doing work in or looking to do work in?
So we're doing some work. Obviously, the surrounding states. So,
Yeah.
state of New York, state of Ohio, Maryland. We're having some. We have a couple of customers there that are building projects, and then we even have a customer down in North Carolina. Now that we won't be shipping out of Pennsylvania. We have a contract manufacturing partner in South Carolina. He's building these cottages down there. So I was up in Albany, New York. There's actually a Habitat for Humanity chapter that we signed a contract with to build some homes for. And I thought that was interesting. They were really curious about modular because if you think about Habitat, a lot of their model is volunteer labor.
Right.
But a lot of the Habitat chapters that are more kind of run like a home builder, they'll they have a staff of construction folks, and they even hire out subcontractors, and the volunteers come in to do a little small things. And so the idea that you could get a box shipped in and the volunteers just have to touch it up is it works well with their model. So that's an interesting use case. Yeah.
So where do you see this going? What's the future? What's the vision for all the modular family of companies you have?
So we really started in design, and we now have our general contracting license locally in our factory. So our goal is to be building 50 homes a year in Pittsburgh. So this year we'll do about 10, but to grow to 50 homes a year, feed that factory, and then long-term vision is because our factory at 20,000 square feet is a fifth of the size or even a tenth of the size of some of the big factories out there. But if we can figure out how to make this small little factory work in a place like Pittsburgh, then it's possible that other cities could open up similar factories. So almost like a franchise type model where if you say, maybe you're a real estate investor in another market and you're like, man, I've got a lot of properties, I've been doing development. So we could almost like license this concept to another owner operator in another market, and they could open their own factory and build product. So that's the long-term vision.
Right.
But step one is to make sure we can get to 50 a year here in Pittsburgh.
And that's again sticking with your infill, kind of more urban oriented locations, right?
That's right.
Okay. So we've worked together a little bit, the bank and Module on your North Side project. So greatly appreciate that relationship. What's your feedback on working with us and working with the bank?
So I've made some recommendations.
Yeah, you have, and we appreciate it.
Because we talk to a lot of banks, and not to generalize, but a lot of the banks just are less entrepreneurial. They don't understand that, and they're looking for reasons to say no. And in working with enterprise, I found that you all were looking for reasons to say yes. And as someone who's starting a small business, that's what I thrive off of. That's what I love. Or I'm trying to find other groups that are saying, why can't we do this? As opposed to saying, why should we do this?
Well, it was a great education for us because we've done construction lending here at the bank since its inception, but never had been through the modular process. So yeah, you mentioned Jesse's, who's your relationship manager here. That was kind of an eye opener for him and us to see how these things got put together once the units were delivered.
Yeah, and it's an education process, right? Yeah. And I think why I think it's great that you all are doing this is as the labor market gets tighter and tighter, more contractors are going to be of all kinds, not just residential, but commercial, are going to be buying some level of component, right? You'll see wall panels coming in, trusses coming in. And so there will be more off-site built components to all kinds of construction just because our labor force is not what it used to be.
And I mean, hey, time is money, and we're in an elevated interest rate environment. So, when rates were half of what they were now, time delays and carrying costs were manageable. They're a lot more expensive right now.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a great time to explore what you guys are doing. So through this journey, I always ask, what is your advice for people that are aspiring or people new as entrepreneurs in the business, whether it's construction or otherwise?
I would say as an entrepreneur, because we've been going at this now 8 years. Yeah. It's not as sexy as I thought it would be. That's the first thing. And because of that, you really got to believe in what you're doing. It can't just be, oh, I'm going to make a bunch of money. Like, I don't think if that's the only thing that drives you, then when times get tough and you're going to have to just stick it out, you need something that drives you in addition to, your goal of being a successful business person. So what is that? And make sure that is if that's crystallized in your brain, then I think you can do almost anything you put your mind to. That's kind of how I think about it.
Excellent. So how can, let's say, a developer or even a potential home buyer, how do they learn more about what you guys are doing on all these different fronts?
So our website's, I think, a good resource to go to as a first step, modulhousing.com. And the other thing I'll say is we're pretty active on LinkedIn. So we're putting out a lot of content on LinkedIn, videos about the factory.
Yeah, I know you guys are very good about visuals of how the process works and, design options and those types of things.
Yeah, so I think those online channels are great. And then, we've hosted some factory tours. So that might even be a fun thing to collaborate on enterprise with is we've hosted a couple of factory tours. We even did a developer training earlier this year. So, part of our job is to educate a developer on why they might want to choose modular construction. So we actually hosted some speakers in from out of town, and we had about 40 developers there in this. We had a space in Garfield, and we had a couple of speakers, and everyone was at little small tables, and they could talk and learn from each other. So I think occasionally we'll do events like that where we'll invite developers. But I think reaching out on our website, if folks want to come see our factory or even walk through any of our homes, that's I think is a visual. Our field is very visual, and when people have heard about modular, there are probably hundreds of images in their heads.
Again, when first met you, I was victim of that mentality too, thinking, what are these mobile homes? Mm-hmm. Totally different. Different. Greatly appreciate the information. This is obviously an emerging method of construction. It has a lot of benefits for a lot of people. It's like anything else in our area. It's awareness. And the more they get built, the more people can see. I think the better for the industry, better for module. So appreciate the relationship. Thanks for the info. For those of you that have any ideas for future episodes or any questions, you can email us at insidethevault@enterprisebankpgh.com. You can check us out on all the major podcast platforms in audio format and in video format on YouTube. Brian, thanks much for the info. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. This was great.
Excellent.